December 1944. The Ardennes is burning. Columns of German Panthers, sleek, lethal, and almost invincible, roll through the fog toward American lines. Their 75mm guns tear through the forest like thunder. Every shot means another Sherman in flames. For months, the US tank crews have fought with courage, but frustration. They knew their standard 75mm rounds bounced harmlessly off Panther armor, even at close range. Many crews nicknamed their Shermans Ronsons, like the cigarette lighter, because they lit up the first time every time. But something is different this morning. At the edge of a Belgian road, a small unit from the 3rd Armored Division takes position behind a ridge. Among them is Lieutenant Bill Summers, a 23-year-old tank commander who's already seen too many friends die in tanks that stood no chance. His crew loads a round they've only just received. It looks odd, a tungsten core, sleeker, darker, denser. On the casing, a new marking, M93 HVAP, high-velocity armor piercing. A heartbeat, the clink of a shell sliding into the breach. Let's see if this thing's worth the name. A German Panther appears through the fog, turret turning. The Sherman fires, the recoil jolts the tank violently. The crew stares in disbelief. The mighty Panther burns. For the first time in months, the Sherman's gun hasn't just scratched paint, it's killed a giant. That single shot would echo across the battlefields of Europe. The Germans had dismissed the 76mm Sherman as hopelessly outmatched, but now they were wrong. Because inside that small tungsten-cored projectile lay the answer to one of the war's most desperate problems: how to turn David's slingshot into a weapon that could strike down Goliath. The HVAP round would not only change the balance of power in tank warfare, it would change how American crews felt when they went into battle. Confidence replaced fear. Hope replaced helplessness. But this story isn't just about a shell. It's about invention born from desperation, about engineers racing against time and tankers who risked everything to test the impossible. Archival footage of Shermans advancing through snowy woods, tanks silhouetted against firelight. And it began with one idea, that maybe, just maybe, the underdog could fight back. Now, how did the Americans develop this tungsten-tipped miracle, and why did the Germans never see it coming? By 1942, the United States had entered a mechanized war it wasn't ready for. The M4 Sherman, the workhorse of the Allied armies, was fast, reliable, and easy to build. But as the war dragged on, it faced a terrifying truth. Technology was catching up, and America's most common tank was becoming obsolete. When the Sherman first appeared in North Africa, it was a match for most German tanks, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, even the early Tigers if luck was on the American side. But by 1944, on the battlefields of France, that balance collapsed. The Germans had unleashed something else entirely: the Panther. The Panther wasn't just another tank, it was a hunter. Its sloped armor could deflect most Allied shells, and its 75mm high-velocity gun could destroy a Sherman at nearly 2,000 meters, long before the Americans could even see their enemy. Against such power, US crews had little hope. Letters home told the same story. We fired and watched it bounce. Fired again, same thing. The Panther turned, and one shot from him ended it. I don't know how many more friends I can watch burn in these things. Black and white footage, wrecked Shermans in hedgerows, crews digging foxholes beside their tanks. The Sherman's original 75mm gun, designed for infantry support, not tank duels, was never meant to fight these beasts. But the war didn't wait for perfect designs. So American engineers raced against the clock. In Detroit and Aberdeen at the Ordnance Department, new ideas took shape. The 76mm gun was developed, longer, faster, more penetrating, but even that wasn't enough. Armor-piercing shells could still fail against the Panther's glacis plate. The problem wasn't accuracy or courage, it was physics. To penetrate that sloped, hardened steel, a projectile needed more speed and more density. That's when the engineers turned to an extraordinary element: tungsten. Close-up animation of a tungsten-cored shell being forged, sparks flying, The words high-velocity armor-piercing, MEM-93 HVAP, appear on screen. Tungsten was rare, dense, heavy, and incredibly hard. A material used for cutting steel, not killing tanks, but its properties were ideal for piercing armor. If they could make a round light enough to fire faster, yet strong enough to stay intact on impact, they might just level the battlefield. The concept was revolutionary: a lightweight outer casing for high muzzle velocity and a tungsten core for maximum penetration. But there was a catch. Tungsten was scarce. The US had limited access, and every round had to be justified. Tank crews might receive just a handful per battle. Footage of American tankers inspecting HVAP rounds, noting their black tips and unusual markings. The first batches rolled out quietly. No fanfare, no press release. Only a few divisions received them during the summer of 1944. And when they did, the effect was immediate and devastating. One officer from the 4th Armored Division wrote in disbelief, "It was like turning on the light in a dark room. For the first time, we could hit back. Panthers burning in open fields. Shermans advancing through smoke." The Germans had no idea this new ammunition existed until their tanks started dying to guns they thought couldn't touch them. And that's when panic began to ripple through panzer units. Because soon the Americans wouldn't just have better shells, they'd learn how to use them in ways the Germans never anticipated. They called themselves Lucky 13. 5 young men, barely older than college kids, part of the 33rd Armored Regiment, 3rd Armored Division. They'd been fighting their way across France and Belgium since June 1944. Now it was December, the Battle of the Bulge had erupted, and winter had swallowed everything. Inside their Sherman, a 76mm Easy 8, they tried to stay warm. The air smelled of diesel and damp wool. In the turret, Lieutenant Bill Summers, the commander, studied a new round resting on his lap. Its casing gleamed dully in the lamplight. "They say this thing can punch through a Panther. Don't know if I believe it. But if it saves one of us, that's enough." Next to him sat Corporal Eddie Ramirez, the gunner, quick with a joke, but his hands trembled every time they loaded a shell. Private Henry Lowe, the loader, 19 years old, had stopped writing home after seeing what German 88s could do. And then there was Red McKinney, the driver from Kentucky, a mechanic before the war. He used to race cars. Now he drove a tank through hell. These were ordinary men, not heroes by choice, but by circumstance. They'd watched too many Shermans burn. They'd buried friends under white crosses that stretched for miles. So when the new HVAP rounds arrived, they treated them like a miracle. Each tank got only five chances to even the score. Close-up gloved hands loading the sleek tungsten round into the breech. They nicknamed it the Dart because it moved faster than anything they'd fired before, and for a moment it made them believe maybe the Germans weren't invincible after all. But belief doesn't stop fear. That night, as snow began to fall, radio chatter crackled through static, reports of Panther columns moving south. The 33rd would have to hold a crossroads near the town of Hotten. 5 darts. Use them only when you got a sure shot, the rest pray. Sherman engines roar to life. Tracks grind through snow. The fog swallows them whole. At dawn, they rolled into position behind a ruined farmhouse, watching the tree line. The air was heavy, silent. Every man knew what it meant when a Panther appeared on the horizon, a death sentence. Except this time, they had something new, something the Germans didn't know existed. Ramirez sighted his scope. The first Panther appeared, a black silhouette through the mist. Then another. 3. Summers whispered, "Hold, wait till he turns his flank." In those frozen seconds, 5 men waited, hearts pounding in unison. They weren't just fighting tanks. They were fighting the memory of every friend who never made it home. The ground shook. One round struck nearby, shrapnel peppered the Sherman's hull. The crew held firm. Summers called out, "Now." The gun fired. The HVAP round tore across the field, faster, sharper, deadlier. The Panther stopped dead. Smoke billowed. The crew inside Lucky 13 erupted. Disbelief, laughter, tears. They had done the impossible. Got him. Jesus. It went right through. For a moment, in the middle of war's chaos, 5 men remembered what hope felt like. But the battle wasn't over. There were still 2 more Panthers and only 4 darts left. The hunters had become the hunted. And soon both sides would discover the battlefield had changed forever. The crossroads at Houghton had become a graveyard of steel. And in the middle of it, Lucky 13 still fought on. Their first kill had sent shockwaves through the unit. Word spread fast. A Sherman took down a Panther head-on. Some called it luck. Others whispered about new secret shells. But to the Germans, it was something else. Impossible. Archival reenactment. German officers gathered around a map table, listening to reports from the front. German officer, subtitled Dramatization. Panther 112 destroyed by frontal hit. Range 1,000 meters. Impossible. For the first time, German panzer commanders began questioning their own invincibility. Reports trickled in, tanks lost to hits that should have ricocheted. They suspected new Allied weaponry, but intelligence had no answers. Meanwhile, the Americans pressed their luck. Each Sherman crew that had received HVAP rounds guarded them like gold. Some crews refused to use them unless the odds were desperate. Others loaded them at the first sign of a Panther, knowing every second counted. Inside Lucky 13's Sherman, the crew reloads quickly, sweat mixing with grime. The loader's hands shake as he fumbles with the next tungsten round. Second one sets turning. Hit his side. The second Panther erupted. Its ammunition cooked off in a blinding flash that lit up the fog. But victory had a price. Moments later, the third Panther's gun swung around and fired. The Sherman lurched violently. Armor cracked. Smoke filled the cabin. McKinney coughed, blood on his sleeve. "We cert hit. Engine sept's gone." Summers steadied his voice, even as fire spread in the rear compartment. "Get out. Now." Crew members scramble out through the hatch, flames licking the hull behind them. Snow and smoke swirl as they take cover in a ditch. They watched their tank, their home, their lifeline, burn. The same machine that had given them hope was now a funeral pyre. But that day, Lucky 13 wasn't unlucky. A recovery crew later found them alive, shaken but unbroken. American tankers regrouping, snow falling quietly over the wreckage. The war had become a cruel balance. New weapons promised survival, but no one truly felt safe. The HVAP rounds were working, but they were rare. Tungsten was so limited that many crews went into battle without a single one. They knew the science existed to save them, but not the supply. Behind the front lines, the Ordnance Department scrambled. They appealed to Allied nations for tungsten from Portugal, from China, from every mine they could reach. But it was never enough. So they rationed it, a few precious shells per crew. 5 chances, and no more. Meanwhile, German High Command was starting to panic. Engineers at Spares Ministry demanded answers. How had the Americans suddenly gained the power to pierce Panther armor? But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. They hadn't yet built a new tank. They'd simply unlocked the full potential of the one they already had. Every battle now carried whispers which side would adapt faster. Could innovation outrun destruction? Because both armies were learning the same brutal lesson. In war, the side that innovates last doesn't survive. Now inside the American laboratories where scientists worked day and night to perfect the HVAP shell, and how one breakthrough would forever change tank warfare. By January 1945, the snow-covered forests of Belgium had become a graveyard for men and machines alike. The promise of the HVAP round had given American tank crews a spark of hope, but the flame was flickering. Because for every Panther they destroyed, 3 more seemed to appear. The German counter-offensive, what would be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, had thrown the Allies into chaos. Communications collapsed, fuel ran short, and in the middle of it all, tankers were discovering a cruel truth. You can win a war with 5 shells. Inside a frozen Sherman, soldiers count their remaining rounds, just 1 HVAP shell left. 1 dart left. After that, we are stir back to prayers. Morale began to break. Crews that had once believed the HVAP round could save them now faced the same terror as before. Many tanks still carried mostly standard AP rounds, good against Panzer IVs, useless against Panthers or Tigers. In after-action reports, officers wrote in frustration, "We can kill them if we hit them right, but we never have enough of the right ammo." Footage of US supply convoys struggling through snow and mud, trucks bogged down, drivers exhausted. The supply chain couldn't keep up. Tungsten shipments from overseas were delayed by U-boat attacks. Factories back home couldn't refine enough to meet demand. The engineers had done their part. But logistics were bleeding the innovation dry, and the Germans were adapting. German officers examined captured HVAP shells, notes scribbled, measurements taken. Captured HVAP rounds were sent to German testing grounds near Kummersdorf. Within weeks, intelligence reports mentioned a new word, Hartkern munition. The arms race was accelerating again. In the Ardennes, as snowstorms raged and roads froze solid, American tankers held their ground, tired, cold, and afraid. Many hadn't slept in days. Letters home became quieter, shorter. "We thought these new shells would change everything. Maybe they did, maybe not enough. The Panthers keep coming. We just keep firing." Hope, once so bright, was dimming. They'd lost their Sherman days ago. Only 2 of the original crew remained uninjured. McKinney was gone, killed by shrapnel during a retreat. The men buried him by the roadside under a wooden cross, the snow covering the mound before dawn. Summers wrote one final note in his pocket diary. "We had one miracle. Maybe that's all we were meant to have." By mid-January, the Allies began to push the Germans back, but the cost was enormous. Thousands of Shermans destroyed, hundreds of tankers lost. The HVAP round had proven it could turn a 76mm gun into a Panther-Killer, but there simply weren't enough to go around. In the end, technology couldn't replace endurance. War tests the limits of machines, but it breaks the limits of men. And yet, even in their darkest hour, the Americans refused to give up. Because in the ashes of defeat, new ideas were already being born. Ideas that would transform tank warfare and lead to the next phase of the fight. Now inside the hidden laboratories where American scientists pushed the boundaries of physics, racing to create an even deadlier generation of HVAP shells. While tank crews fought in the snow and mud of Europe, another kind of battle raged thousands of miles away in laboratories and steel mills across the United States. It was a race against time. Every report from the front painted the same grim picture. American armor was brave but undergunned. The 76mm cannon could win only if fed with HVAP rounds, and those were running out. So the Ordnance Department turned to the men behind the machines, the metallurgists, chemists, and ballistics experts who were rewriting the laws of physics one shell at a time. Close-up of an engineer examining a tungsten core under magnification. At the Watertown Arsenal in Massachusetts, scientists worked around the clock to refine the tungsten core, to make it smaller, faster, harder. They tested hundreds of variations. Some shattered on impact, others slowed too quickly. But then, in February 1945, a breakthrough. By optimizing the weight of the steel jacket and reshaping the tungsten penetrator, the team achieved something extraordinary, a round that could leave the Sherman's barrel at over 3,400 feet per second, nearly 1,000 feet faster than standard AP shells. When fired, it didn't just punch through armor, it drilled through it. High-speed footage of a tungsten core penetrating a thick armor plate, sparks bursting from the exit side. It felt like alchemy, turning metal into light. For the first time, we saw the impossible happen. The US Army called it the M93 HVAPT, the T for tracer. Crews could now see the fiery streak of tungsten death as it cut through the air. But the science alone wasn't the turning point. It was the faith of those who wielded it. When new shipments arrived in Europe, something changed in the way the men talked, the way they moved. Fear had turned to defiance. Lieutenant Summers and what remained of Lucky 13 received a replacement Sherman near Cologne in March 1945, this one freshly fitted with the new HVAP rounds. Sunlight glints off the tank's sun barrel. Summers runs a hand along a crate marked Min 93 HVAPT. Let's see if the miracle still works. Across the Rhine, the Germans were still fielding Panthers, and the last of the mighty Tigers, but their confidence was eroding. Reports from panzer units spoke of unidentified American ammunition that could pierce their armor frontally at 1,500 meters. Some tankers refused to believe it until they saw the glowing tracers streak toward them and felt the impact. American tanks line up behind a ridge. The sun burns through smoke. The order comes. Fire. Gunfire. The sharp crack of the 76mm streaks of tracer light cross the field. Explosions bloom across German lines. The new HVAP shells didn't just destroy tanks, they destroyed the myth of German invulnerability. For the first time since Normandy, American crews went into battle believing they could win. Somerset's crew scored 2 kills that day, both Panthers, both frontal shots. He wrote later in a field diary, "We stopped being prey. That's what it felt like. We stopped being prey." Montage Shermans advancing across the Rhine, Allied troops cheering, German positions collapsing. By spring 1945, the tide had turned. The HVAP round had transformed the Sherman from an underdog into a credible tank killer. Not perfect, never invincible, but finally enough. In the end, it wasn't a new tank that changed the war. It was a handful of men and a few ounces of tungsten, shaped by courage and desperation. But as victory approached, the true cost of that innovation, in resources, lives and moral weight, was only beginning to be understood. By spring, the tide of war in Europe had shifted. The Allies were on the offensive, driving into the heart of Germany. But raw courage alone didn't win ground. Adaptation did. The introduction of HVAP rounds had forced a complete rethink of American tank warfare. The days of blind courage and desperate flanking maneuvers were ending. Now science and precision ruled the battlefield. Officers cluster around a sand table. Models of Panthers and Shermans mark positions. The new doctrine was simple and deadly effective. Use mobility. Strike first. Fire HVAP at range before the Germans could close the distance. Each unit learned to conserve their few tungsten rounds for critical targets. Ordinary armor-piercing shells still had their place, but HVAP became the ace in the hole. Red 6 to all tanks. HVAP, on standby. Panthers in the tree line, 3:00 fist o'clock. Shermans fan out in formation, taking hull-down positions behind rubble. The first volley of HVAP rounds screams across the field, flashes of impact as German tanks burst into flames. For the first time, US tankers were fighting with confidence, not fear. They moved faster, struck smarter, and trusted their weapons to deliver. Even the feared 88mm guns of the German Tigers began losing their psychological edge. When hit with tungsten, no armor seemed safe. In after-action reports, American commanders described a shift in morale so dramatic it bordered on disbelief. Crews no longer avoid engagement with Panthers. The 76mm gun, when fired with HVAP, has proven sufficient in the hands of a calm gunner. The underdogs had learned to hunt, and the Germans knew it. Panzer divisions began adjusting tactics, avoiding open duels and withdrawing from engagements they once dominated. In some cases, they even mistook ordinary AP rounds for HVAP. Behind the front, logistics caught up. By April 1945, tungsten production had tripled. Enough rounds were finally reaching the front lines to equip entire armored battalions. The Allied advance quickened through the Siegfried Line across the Rhine, deep into the industrial heart of Germany. Everywhere American tankers learned the same lesson. Technology mattered, but teamwork decided survival. Tank destroyers coordinated with infantry and air support. Forward observers marked targets. Engineers cleared obstacles, and when the Shermans finally fired, the results were devastating. The 76mm Sherman, once dismissed as obsolete, had become a symbol of adaptation of a nation learning to fight smarter under impossible odds. Yet amid the victories, one truth haunted everyone who had been there. Every improvement came too late for someone. Every breakthrough was bought with lives already lost. For Lieutenant Bill Summers and what remained of Lucky 13, each battle now felt like both redemption and reminder that their survival rested on the sacrifice of those who had gone before. We stir winning now. But it's sight strange. It doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally being allowed to live. The war was nearing its end, but its lessons were only beginning. Now the final clashes of the war, where HVAP rounds helped deliver victory, and the staggering human cost that victory revealed. By the final months of the war, Germany's armoured fist was broken, but not gone. The Wehrmacht's remaining panzer units had fallen back into the heart of the Reich, defending every bridge, every road, every hilltop with desperate fury. Among them were the last of Hitler's steel beasts, the Königstiger, or King Tiger, a 70-ton monster, with armour so thick it could shrug off nearly anything the Allies could throw at it. To most soldiers, facing one meant certain death. But now the Americans carried something new, a bullet forged from science, precision, and resolve. The M93 HVAP. Its tungsten core was small, just a few inches of dense metal, but it could slice through armour that had once seemed invincible. On April 11, 1945, near the German town of Dessau, that promise was tested. A platoon from the 3rd Armoured Division was pinned by 2 King Tigers blocking a crossroads. The Shermans couldn't flank, the streets were too narrow. The situation was hopeless. King Tiger fired first. One round hit our lead Sherman, went clean through. Fire everywhere. The surviving Shermans reversed behind a wall of rubble. The radio crackled. One voice, calm, deliberate, broke the chaos. Load HVAP. Aim for the turret ring, fire. The tungsten round screamed through the air and struck. It punched straight through the King Tiger's side armor, igniting ammunition inside. A fireball tore through the beast. For a moment the battlefield went silent. Then, a second Tiger tried to retreat. 2 more HVAP rounds followed. Another hit, another explosion. For the first time, American crews had destroyed Germany's heaviest tank in direct combat, not with numbers, not with air support, but with their own gun. That single engagement echoed across every armoured division. The myth of German invincibility was over. Reports from the front described a strange new confidence. Tankers once haunted by fear now felt something close to pride. In the Ardennes, in the Ruhr pocket, in the outskirts of Berlin, everywhere the Allies advanced, the HVAP round became legend. We faced a Tiger yesterday. For the first time, I didn't feel doomed. We fired once. It burned. We laughed and cried at the same time. The reversal was complete. The hunter had become the hunted. And in that moment, brief and terrible, the balance of fear shifted. But victory carried its own price. The war was ending, but the bodies still lay where they fell, both American and German, side by side in the mud. Technology had turned the tide, but humanity had paid the cost. Every Sherman that advanced over a destroyed Panther or Tiger carried ghosts in its tracks, reminders of those who had died learning how to win. For the men of Lucky 13, the war that had once seemed endless was finally drawing to a close. But with every step deeper into Germany, one question lingered. Had they triumphed because of the machine, or in spite of it? As the guns fell silent, the world began to reckon with what victory truly meant, and how a small piece of tungsten changed the face of armoured warfare forever. When the guns at last fell silent, Europe was unrecognizable. Entire cities lay buried under ash and stone. Millions were dead. For the tank crews who had survived, the sudden quiet was almost unbearable. They had spent months hearing the growl of engines, the whistle of shells, the scream of steel. Now only wind. For Lucky 13, only 3 tanks rolled home. Of the original 30 crewmen who'd trained together in England, just 9 were still alive. Lieutenant Bill Summers wrote one final entry in his field diary, the same small notebook he'd carried since Normandy. It sets over. The guns have stopped. But sometimes I still hear them. We beat them, Panthers, Tigers, all of it. But I don't feel proud. I feel empty, like all that metal swallowed something human along the way. For many, victory brought no celebration, only relief and guilt. The US Army demobilized millions, shipping them home by the thousands. The Shermans, once lifelines of survival, were left rusting in fields across Europe. The HVAP rounds that had saved lives were stacked and forgotten in arsenals, relics of a war the world wanted to bury. Tungsten, once more valuable than gold, became a tool for rebuilding rather than destruction. But its wartime secret, the precision and science that made the 76mm Sherman a Panther-Killer, laid the foundation for a new age of weapons design. The lessons of HVAP would shape everything that came next. From the Korean War SEP's Pershing tanks, to the Cold War SIP's M48 patterns, to modern armor-piercing rounds that still echo that same idea: speed, density, precision. Yet no formula could capture the cost. For every tank that survived, hundreds of men didn't. For every breakthrough, there were fields where soldiers never came home. The HVAP round had given the Americans a weapon of equality, a way to fight on even ground against an enemy who once seemed unstoppable. But in the eyes of the survivors, it wasn't just a bullet that pierced armor. It pierced the illusion that war could ever truly be won. Bill Summers returned to Kansas in the summer of 1945. He never commanded another tank. He became a mechanic, fixing tractors, not Shermans. He said he preferred machines that helped things grow. In his shed, on a dusty shelf, he kept one relic, an empty HVAP shell casing. On its side, he said scratched 3 words: "So this is peace." The HVAP round was born of necessity and desperation, but it became a symbol of human ingenuity under fire. It reminds us that even in the darkest moments of war, it is not hatred that drives invention, but the will to survive. When the tanks finally stopped rolling, and the men returned home, they carried with them not just stories of fire and victory, but the memory of how fragile life can be when the world is made of steel. But history never sleeps. What began with a single tungsten shell would evolve into a new era, one defined by power, progress, and the haunting question of what humanity does with the weapons it creates. The story of HVAP rounds is not just the story of a tungsten bullet. It is the story of courage, ingenuity, and the human will to survive against impossible odds. The M93 HVAP turned ordinary 76mm Shermans, once dismissed as underpowered, into weapons capable of facing Germany's most feared tanks. It altered battles, saved lives, and even shifted the psychological balance on the front lines. Yet its legacy is more than technical. It is a reminder that in war, human innovation meets human cost. Every shell fired carried with it fear, sacrifice, and the hope of survival. Every tank destroyed, every town liberated, every life lost. These were the echoes of courage that shaped history. The lessons endure. That ingenuity alone cannot win a war. It must be wielded with wisdom. That bravery is measured not just in firepower, but in the faces of those who endure it. And that the smallest spark of hope, even a single HVAP round, can shift the course of history. So when you see a Sherman, or a Panther, or even a simple shell casing, remember, these are more than machines. They are the stories of men who fought, suffered, and survived. Stories that remind us that history is never just about battles or bullets. It is about humanity. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history, because these echoes must never be forgotten.